Hey friends, I'm so excited to announce my brand new ebook, The Ultimate Kitchen Guide to Food Storage, Freezer Rotation, and Zero Food Waste. I am so proud of this. It is chocked full of information to help you get organized in the kitchen. Plus, it has 10 of my very best freezer recipes. Definitely check it out. Only $10 for the month of February. There will be a link in the description box. I'd appreciate your support. Thank you so much. Hi everybody, I'm Amy with Eating Healthy, Spending Less, and today we're going to do a sourdough Q&A. I hope to answer all of your questions. Let's get started. Okay, so the first question is, why sourdough? The reasoning why my husband and I fell in love with sourdough is going to be a totally different reason for maybe somebody else. For us, it comes down to the fact that one of our friends, Grace, taught us how sourdough is really good for people that have gluten sensitivities. My husband and I both do. My husband's is definitely much more severe than mine. I was gluten-free for 7 years, actually. And so when she told us that a lot of people with gluten sensitivities can tolerate sourdough, it sparked our interest. We're like, what? Because honestly, sourdough bread is so much more delicious and wonderful than eating gluten-free bread. There's very few gluten-free breads on the market that are actually worth eating. And so we decided to give it a try. We both did have some mild, very mild reactions when we started eating sourdough. And when I say it, my husband went full force. He would have a few slices of bread. I would take a bite and that was it. And then next week I would take maybe 2 bites. And so I kind of eased my way into it. And it took me about a month until I noticed that I had absolutely 0 reactions. So why can gluten-free or gluten-sensitive people handle sourdough? Well, during the fermentation process of the sourdough starter, it breaks down the gluten in the flour. And so it just makes it easier for your stomach to digest sourdough bread. So if you have gluten sensitivities, you might want to give it a try. That is the reasoning why we continue to make sourdough bread. And we have had our starter for almost a year now. And there is absolutely no going back. I will not let my sourdough starters go because it has just changed our world. We now make sourdough donuts, bagels, dinner rolls, crackers, bread, dumplings, pizza crust. Everything that we do is sourdough. And if we don't have flour, then I immediately go to oats and I make oat flour and I do the whole gluten-free thing, making things with oats. We do not ever really use a gluten-free all-purpose flour. There's just so many additives to it. And so for us, that's what works. Now, if you have celiac disease, you need to stay far away from sourdough using regular flour. I will never recommend that. But if you just have kind of a gluten sensitivity, a digestive upset when you eat flour, definitely give it a try. It has been well worth it for my husband and I. Okay, that was just one question. We have a lot of questions, so let's keep going. What kind of flour do I use? So I only use a high quality flour. I use the King Arthur brand flour. I buy this in a 25-pound bag at Smart & Finals. It's about $18. And I have only fed my starter with King Arthur all-purpose unbleached flour. There's only 2 ingredients. And let's see. It's unbleached hard red wheat flour and malted barley flour. That's it. So when you go to the store, if you buy maybe a cheaper flour, you're going to see where it has niacin and other additives added to the flour. I wanted to make sure that because we have a sensitivity, I'm always using a high quality flour with absolutely zero additives. So I pay the extra price and I buy that flour. Okay, so how do I get started? So you want to start making a sourdough starter. And one question here was, where do you even start? How do you even start making a starter? So it's so easy. I actually have a video on this. I will put it in the description box below. It explains the whole process of how to make a sourdough starter, step by step, day by day, of how to make it. And it's worth it. It is a process. You have to babysit it, but it's worth it. Okay, so why do you have to discard half of your starter as you're making it? This was a question I got hundreds of times this last week on Instagram. Why do I have to discard or take away and throw away half of my starter before I feed it? The reasoning is that when you are starting this fermentation process of your starter, you need to cut it in half to feed it again. If you don't, your starter is going to just keep growing in bulk. And then you're going to have to double, triple, quadruple the amount of flour and water that you're adding to your starter to even get it to ferment. So just in those first few days, you need to discard your starter. The other question was, can I keep the discard and start a new starter? The simple answer is yes, you can, but I don't recommend it. You are going to spend much more money in flour to bulk up or to feed multiple starters than if you just throw away some of your starter and keep feeding it. I know it's hard to do, but trust me, it's worth it in the end, and it only takes about a week to make a really good bubbly starter. Okay, the other most popular question: what does it mean to bulk up your starter? How can you make so many loaves of bread at one time when I have just this little amount of starter? So here's the deal. When we make sourdough bread in our house, we always make at least 6 loaves of bread and we freeze half of them. That way, our sourdough bread supply lasts us about 2 weeks before I have to make another 6 to 8 loaves of bread. So how do you bulk it up? A couple of days before I decide I'm going to make sourdough bread, I start feeding my starter more than 120 grams of flour and water. So last night, I started bulking my starter. This is my original starter that I started with last year. And I fed it last night, and it's very bubbly, as you can see. I have a lot of starter in here to begin with. Now, I can just maintain my starter by just feeding it 120 grams of water and flour. However, every Friday night, we have sourdough pizza night at my parents' house, and I need my starter to be almost up to the top of this bowl because we make 6 to 7 pizzas every Friday. Also, we make other sourdough favorites throughout the week. So I need starter on a consistent basis. So I will feed my starter 300 grams of water and 300 grams of flour. Or I will feed it 500 grams of flour and 500 grams of water. And I am very careful with this method because when you bulk your starter, you need to allow the starter time to ferment. So if I am wanting to hurry and I don't have very much starter, but I bulk it up 500 grams of flour and water, I need to allow my starter to ferment that. I don't just use it the next day to make bread, or my bread is not really going to rise. This is your yeast. This is the active ingredient that's going to give you all those wonderful bubbles inside your bread and make it big and poofy. And you will notice that if your starter is not fermented enough, then your bread is not going to rise. That's why it's okay to use your discard for pizza or crackers or things like that that don't need to rise. But if you're really wanting to use a recipe where you need it to rise, you need a very active, bubbly, fermented starter. So, for instance, on Friday when we have pizza night, I make sure that I start a few days ahead of time and I slowly start bulking up my starter. 300 grams of water and flour. And then the next night, 300 grams of water and flour. And I do that for about 2 to 3 days. And then the night before we're going to have pizza night, I bulk it 500 grams because I already have so much starter in here. It's not going to affect my starter or deplete the fermentation of it if I add 500 grams of water and flour. Now I will say there is no specific regimented rules to your starter. So if you forget to feed your starter someday, this thing is very forgiving. No worries. I know some of you have forgotten to feed your starter this last week, and it's okay. Your starter will be fine. Okay, the next question. Will you share your sourdough pizza crust recipe? The answer is yes, and it will be coming out very soon here on YouTube. And it's just one ingredient, starter. Okay, if you accidentally forget to feed your starter, do you throw it away and start over? No, you don't. Now, if you forget to feed your starter for a few days, you're going to notice a hard crust, kind of like this crust that's forming on the side. No worries, it's not going to be harmful or hurtful to you. But if I did not feed my starter for a few days, a very hard floured crust is going to form over the top. You have one of two options. You can either stir it back in if it's not too hard, or peel it off and just throw it away and then feed your starter. So no need to throw it away, just feed it. What type of baking dish do you use to bake your bread? Okay, so I have two methods for baking bread. I like these silicone baking bread loaf pans. We do not use any oil in our house. And so I don't ever oil or butter a pan or flour it. I prefer to just leave it as is when I put it in a pan. So for these silicone ones, I don't need any parchment paper because they're not going to stick. So I just simply put my loaves of bread in here, wrap them up, and I bake them in these. These make really pretty loaves of bread. I bought these at Aldi's for like $2 or $3. You can also get them on Amazon. The other loaf pans that I use, I have 4 of these. These are the extra large or extra long Wilton brand loaf pans. These sell out on Amazon a lot of times when I post about them. So occasionally if you click on my link to these loaf pans, they are going to say currently unavailable. But within a few days, they always seem to be back in stock. So check often if it says currently unavailable. But these right here make the most beautiful, beautiful loaves of sourdough bread. So I highly recommend you purchasing these. They're very inexpensive. You can get a 2-pack for just over $10 normally. And I do put a piece of parchment paper in here, just so that when they're done baking, I can easily take them out of the pan and it's an easy cleanup. There's nothing that sticks. So I love these very much. Now this last week, my husband and I decided to make 8 loaves of sourdough bread, but I only have 6 loaf pans. So with the other 2 loaves, we cut them up into 120 gram pieces of dough, rolled them up and made little dinner rolls out of them. Those have been so fun and they're so cute and we've really enjoyed eating those. So that's another option. You can just make little tiny loaves, circular loaves, and bake those. Okay. The best gluten-free sourdough substitute flour. I don't know. Honestly, I will put a link in the description box for somebody here on YouTube that makes gluten-free sourdough bread because if you do have celiacs, that would be a great option for you, but that is something I have never experimented with. The other thing is you can add different flours to your starter. So if you run out of, let's say, the King Arthur flour and all you have is whole wheat, you can definitely use that to feed your starter. I know there's a huge movement of people that love einkorn flour, and that is something that maybe I will experiment with in the future. But this is like my comfort zone right now because I know that King Arthur's unbleached flour does not affect us at all, and we can digest it very easily. So not something that I want to switch over to right now, but you can use other flours, of course, to feed your starter. I would not add a gluten-free flour though to this. I would stay away from that. Okay, how long can you store your starter before it goes bad? So eventually, if you just left this in the cabinet and forgot about it for a month or two, the crust is going to form so much that it will totally dry out your starter because this stays active because of the liquid, the water that's in here. So if you go a week without feeding your starter, you're fine. There's no problem, no harm done. You are going to get a hard crust, peel it off, and feed your starter, and you'll be fine. I've never had my starter mold, never. I have 3 starters right now in my cabinet, and I've never had an issue with molding. Now, if it gets too hot, you might have that problem. Or if you are in a more humid climate, you might have that problem. So what I would do in that situation is use my starter when I need it and then store it in the refrigerator when I'm not using it. So if I know that I'm not going to be using my starter for the week, I will use a recipe where I can use up a good portion of my starter. And then I will store about 1 cup of starter in a glass jar or a plastic container in my refrigerator for up to 2 weeks. I've done 3 weeks before, and at 3 weeks I've noticed that the flour and water start to separate. If that happens to you, no worries. You can either pour off the liquid or just stir it back in. If it's a grayish color, it doesn't mean that it's molding, you're fine. So that is what I do. I've only stored it up to 3 weeks before, but normally I try to keep it within a week or 2. However, you're going to notice that the more sourdough recipes you make, you're going to want to keep your starter going because the sourdough is just so good. Sourdough does have a very tangy sour flavor, but it's delicious and your palate changes. And my kids, they just beg for sourdough pancakes all the time now. Okay, where I live, it's cold. What can I do? So when you're starting to make your sourdough starter, in my opinion, the biggest culprit to a sourdough starter not working is the temperature. I believe you can use whatever flour and whatever water you want to use. For me, I mean, think about this. People have been making a sourdough starter for hundreds of thousands of years. I'm sure that the flour and water has not been a big factor, but I think the temperature definitely plays a big role. So if it's cold, I highly recommend finding a warm place for your starter. So a great place would be your oven. Another place when you're not using it is your microwave, because those 2 places stay pretty insulated. For me, I have found that my starter does the best in the cabinet next to my stove. Of course, I don't use my stove every day, all day, but it just seems to be a great warm spot. When I first started making my starter, I kept it next to my kitchen sink. I have a window, as you can see. It was last March when I started. My starter was not getting bubbly. I could not figure out what was going on. Then I realized, I think my starter is too cold. I was keeping it on a tile counter next to a window, and that was not a good thing. So what I did was I put a towel under my starter, and that started helping my starter get more bubbly and active. But then when I put it in a kitchen cabinet next to my stove, it was like an overnight change and my starter just took off. So in my video on my sourdough starter, I show you 2 methods to see if your sourdough starter is ready for baking. There's the float test, where you put a teaspoon of your starter in a cup of water, like lukewarm water, and if it floats, then it's ready to use to make bread. If it sinks, then you need to keep feeding it until it floats. The other one is to wrap a string or a rubber band around your jar. Feed your starter, and if it doubles in size, then it's ready to make bread. So those are 2 options as well. Also, one time it was pretty cold, it was in the winter, and I was making sourdough bread, and my dough would not rise. So I put a heating pad over the top. I turned on my heating pad and I put that over the top, and sure enough, my dough rose and it was beautiful bread. So just play around with it. Nothing you do is going to hurt it. It's going to be fine. And sometimes I put it out in the sunshine, or I even will put it next to the fireplace. As long as you're not trying to cook your starter, you'll be just fine. Okay. Do you always have to leave a little starter after using it? If so, how much? Yes, you definitely want to leave some so that you can feed it and keep your starter going. Of course, if you use it all, then you're going to have to start all over, and you don't want to do that. Think about these European families who pass down their sourdough starters from generation to generation as a wedding gift. How special is that their starters are hundreds of years old? And it's all because after they use it, they leave a little bit left over, refeed it, and keep going. So in my opinion, you're going to see lots of opinions if you Google this on the internet. My opinion is that you keep at least 1/4 to 1/2 of a cup of starter. One time, mine got down to about 2 tablespoons and I panicked. So when I got it down that low to 2 tablespoons, I did not feed it 120 grams of water and flour. I fed it like 30 grams of water and flour, and I slowly built it back up. And there's no specific measurements. You just play around with it. And if you get nervous, message me and I'll do my best to help you. Okay, I addressed that. Where do I store my starter? How do you prep your starter for the fridge? You do nothing. I don't feed it. Let's say I fed it yesterday, but I decide the next day that I'm going to put it in the fridge. I just simply don't feed it. I put some in a jar. I normally do a cup if I can, and then put that in the fridge. So when you put it in the fridge, it slows down the fermentation process and prevents your starter from molding and from growing. It just kind of like maintains it for you. So then what do you do when you take it out of the fridge? So what I do is I wait for it to come down to room temperature. So let's say around noon, I decide, oh, you know what? I need to take my starter out because in a day or two, I need my starter to make bread or whatever. I'll take it out of the fridge around noon, let it sit on the counter, and before I go to bed that night, I'll pour it into a bowl and then I will feed it 120 grams of water, 120 grams of flour. And then the next day, I will do the same thing. I don't ever discard. So once you have made your starter, you never have to discard again. I never discard my starter. And so I just feed it for a day or two. And then when it's very active, like it is right now, then I start bulking it, 300 grams. And then I go up to 500 grams. Maybe I answered them all. Okay, what is the maintenance of a starter? Do you have to still feed it twice a day? I don't think I addressed that specifically. So the answer is no. After your starter is ready to go, so around day 7, you should have a very active, bubbly starter. And if that's the case, you are more than welcome to start making bread. So with my first starter, a long time ago, I was able to make 2 loaves of bread. Now, you're going to say, but there's not very much starter in here. So what you could do the night before is double your amount. So you could do 240 grams of water and 240 grams of flour the night before you want to make bread. You could even do that up to 2 days before you want to make bread and start bulking up your starter. And then when you're done from making the bread, or when I take out however much I need to make bread, then I immediately feed my starter again to start getting it to bulk back up. Okay, I think that's all of the questions that you guys gave me over on Instagram. If you have any other sourdough questions, please leave them in the comments below. I will be sure to answer them. If you're new to my channel, I make YouTube videos all about handcrafted recipes using fresh ingredients and everyday living. And don't forget, this girl is on a budget. I'll see you in the next video, friends. Bye-bye.